Ready? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear us? My name is Julie Bates, and I'm from Australia, and it is my great honour and privilege to be here today to co-chair with my colleague, Frederick L. Teese, from the United States of America. Welcome, everyone, to this very, very important session. I think one of probably the most important sessions at this whole conference today. Why do we fail in responding to the epidemic amongst people who inject drugs? We've got 4 outstanding speakers for you today, and they're from incredibly diverse and varying disciplines, experiences and understanding. What we're going to see is each person will take to the podium and speak for around 10 minutes. At the end of that, we're going to open to the floor. We believe we've got someone from the Netherlands that might speak a little bit about your responses to HIV amongst injecting drug users and where you're standing and faring at the moment. Then we're going to open the floor to a Q&A. And we should wrap up by 6 o'clock with Frederick, who'll give the final summary of today's session. Thank you. So, without further ado, I guess we will invite to the podium our first speaker. If I find the notes here. Our first speaker is Nick Crofts, and I've had the honour to have known Nick for 30 years. I'll just have to mention that. We first came to the Netherlands together at a conference in Noordwijk-on-Zee 30 years ago, and it was my first AIDS conference, and here I am back again with Nick. Nick's been working to engage police in the HIV response for 20 years and is Director of Law Enforcement and HIV Network, which among other activities supports police in lower middle class income communities and countries, supportive of harm reduction in advocacy among and education of their peers. LEAN is the organisation. It's produced a statement of support by police for harm reduction approaches to policing key populations, which has been signed by over, quite a miracle here, 10,000 police worldwide. Nick, pretty amazing, isn't it? Which was launched at the UN Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice in 2013. Lastly, before Nick takes to the podium, LEAN is now working on a statement of support, which you will tell us all about, Nick. Up to the podium.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Michelle and Kate, for getting me involved in this. Why do we fail in responding to the epidemic among people who use drugs? I have one quick, immediate and partial answer, and that is because we have systematically failed to enlist police as partners in the response to HIV. As Scott Burris so memorably put it in the journal article title that I'm extremely jealous of, The Mysterious Case of the Missing Cop. Why is the police not part of our team? It's worth exploring because the experience is that if the police are on your side, anything's possible. If the police are against you, everything's difficult. In the Law Enforcement HIV Network, we have a saying, the police can be your best friend or your worst enemy. So why don't we engage police more? Why systematically around the world in the response to HIV are police seen as the enemy? The thing is that police on the street are the major risk determinant for so many people who are at risk of HIV. If you interview people on the street, sex workers, injecting drug users, people with other gender, about the one thing that increases their risk more than anything else, they will tell you it's the behaviour of the police. And if you ask them what is the one thing that would make their life appreciably better and diminish the risk from HIV substantially, it's to change the police behaviour towards them. Decriminalisation is an absolute necessity, that we decriminalise drug use, we decriminalise sex work, and decriminalise in those countries where homosexuality is decriminalised there. It's absolute, but it takes time. It takes too long for a lot of people to achieve decriminalisation and the good impact of criminalisation, and it doesn't totally remove stigma anyway. A lot of the people who inject drugs are often from underclasses in society, which often has a lot to do with why they inject drugs. And they're often marginalised before they get into drug use. So decriminalising the activity, drug use activity, does not solve all the problems. Police engagement in the HIV response is both, or can be both, a result and a cause of inclusiveness within a society. If you have a society that is an exclusive society, that you are not a member of our society unless you meet certain characteristics, then the role of the police is to protect core society from those marginalised communities. Changing the role of police helps to bring marginalised communities back into society. I'm thinking about this question, why have we failed to respond? I thought we might learn lessons from places where we actually have succeeded in preventing the spread of HIV among injecting drug users. One of those places is Australia. I had a late start to a research career. I was a general practitioner for 15 years before I got into research. My first research project was a cohort study of injecting drug users. I had a big, nearly 1,000 people that we were following, a field-based cohort study of injecting drug use in the early 1990s. The endpoints were incident HIV infection, and I could see my research career going down the tube because we didn't have any. We didn't have any endpoints, and my cohort study was headed to be a failure. I was saved in research terms because along came hepatitis C, and I had this huge body of pedigreed sera and interviews of people who had very high rates of hepatitis C and very high incidence of hepatitis C, but no HIV. What distinguished the Australian response? There were a number of things. One of the major things was the involvement of the affected communities, which I think Australia in the early days did better than anywhere else. But one of the major things was the collaboration of the police. Not uniform, not universal, but a very high degree of collaboration. The police got it. They got it that needle syringe programs were for their benefit, as well as the rest of the community. This is the story in the Netherlands, it's the story in the UK, it's a story in a number of places where there's been a successful outcome of preventing HIV transmission among injecting drug users and from injecting drug use. And a couple of other quick examples. I like to remember my good friends, Dave Purchase in the United States, who started the first legal needle exchange program there. First thing that Dave did when he was getting needle exchange going in Tacoma in Washington State was get the chief of police on side. One of the people who learnt from Dave and was inspired by Dave was a bloke named Aaron Peake. Aaron Peake started the second legal needle exchange in the United States in Hawaii and decided that was too easy. So he ended up in Kathmandu in Nepal. And there he saw people injecting in the street, and there he used his bank card to start a needle syringe program. But the first thing he did was get the senior superintendent of police in charge of narcotics control on side. It makes sense. I do not understand why we don't do it more, and we don't do it more systematically. What haven't we done? We haven't educated police. We haven't systematically put training around harm reduction and the outcomes of police activities into academies. We haven't built it into continuing professional development, and we haven't adequately fostered the role of peer educators within the police, which is what the Law Enforcement HIV Network is about. Finding police who are supportive of harm reduction and bringing them into the fold, bringing them into the network, giving them support and helping them do a job of advocacy and education of their colleagues in their agencies. It sounds a bit pie in the sky if you're talking about police in a lot of countries, because I'm not for a second unaware of the degree of brutality that goes on in a lot of circumstances between police and key affected population, particularly drug users. However, I have yet to run across a police agency anywhere in the world, and I've worked with a lot, where there are not at least one or two individuals who want to do something different. And finding them and supporting them and giving them a peer environment through working with their peers in other countries is incredibly important. The aim of all of this, and I'm going to run out of time, aren't I? Very quickly. The aim of all of this is culture change. The aim of all of this is to use HIV, the opportunities that HIV creates, to move on to the broader areas, issues of culture change within the police. Police are changing anyway globally. There's movements towards professionalisation and seeing different roles for police anyway. We have to link our wagon to theirs. Partly part of that is to look at the broader role and responsibility of police, which is around public health. It's not a surprising statistic, I don't think, to many of you, that in most countries where the data are collected, something like 80 or 85% of calls upon police time and the things that police do have nothing to do with crime. Police are intimately engaged in the public health mission across a whole range of issues, and HIV is but the latest, one of the latest. So what do we need to do? Pardon me. We need to connect and engage with police. The places where this happens, when there are efforts like UNODC over the last few years ran a whole series of workshops in different countries bringing together police and civil society. These are good things because generally the only time a drug user sees a police person is in a situation of conflict. The only time the police see the drug user is in a situation of conflict. Bringing the two together in a situation, a neutral situation, is a start along the road to rehumanising each to the other. So get people around the same table. Connect the agenda with the wider police reform and professionalisation program. And part of that program, that professionalisation program for police, is increased police diversity. We see terrible examples like Ferguson, Missouri, where you have police made up of a demographic that does not represent one little bit the community they're policing. That's the case with every police agency in the world, because no police agency in the world has more than 25% of its members are women. That's Estonia, by the way. Estonia holds the record. And in countries like Pakistan, less than 1% of the police are women. And it has been shown over and over again in many different cultural contexts that a higher proportion of women police leads to better outcomes in relation to these sorts of issues. How's the time? Is that a rude sign or is that a... Okay. I think I might actually leave it there and take up questions. I do want to say more about the Law Enforcement HIV Network, but I can do that. I can do that later on. I hope that I can count on having said something provocative, at least, that somebody will come back at me with a question on. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for that presentation. I also want to just point out that it's really a privilege to co-moderate with 4 extremely different and diverse speakers, all of whom I've admired for many, many years. And the next speaker is no less among them. MJ Molloy comes from the University of British Columbia. He's an assistant professor there, and he has been working with people who use and inject drugs for many years and is the principal investigator of the Access cohort with over 1,100 HIV-infected people who use drugs. He is going to bring us to the science of why we have failed with drugs, and he is going to use as his test tube the situation in British Columbia. Thank you, MJ.
Thank you very much, Dr. Altice, for that. Oops, I've already broken it. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you as well for the invitation to speak with you today. It is a real honor and a pleasure for me to share the stage and to see so many people in the audience whose work and research and action on behalf of people who use drugs I have admired for so long. It's a bit daunting to see in the agenda beside my name, The View from Science, so I'll try and do my best to be up to that task. And as Rick mentioned, what I would like to do is try to share with you some of the data that we've generated in Vancouver in an attempt to understand the reasons why, when it comes to HIV prevention and care, too often do people who use drugs lag behind in terms of those important metrics. Before I continue, I want to share my disclosures. I receive peer-reviewed fundings from these governments as well as private funding from a private firm, but obviously they have no impact on what I'm about to say to you today. Thinking about this question, why do people who use drugs, why do people who inject drugs so often not receive the full lion's share of HIV prevention and care, for me, brought to mind the situation in Vancouver back in the mid-1990s. And then, in the downtown east side, the center of the city, the prevalence of HIV among people who use drugs went, in the short space of about 18 months, from 1 in 100 to over 1 in 4. and it was widely thought that that was the worst outbreak of HIV ever witnessed in the Western world. It was not only a public health crisis, but it was also a scientific mystery, because at the time, Vancouver had the third largest needle exchange program in North America. And the fact that up until the mid-1990s, the prevalence of HIV had remained quite low was largely thought to be a result of that successful program. So the sudden explosive outbreak of HIV was quite a problem. Many things happened. A public health emergency was declared, and a lot of scientific activity took place to try and understand and answer the question, how could an explosive outbreak among drug users occur somewhere with a large and robust needle exchange operation and with access to things like methadone? This study was one of the first to try and answer that question, and it was the result of an ongoing prospective cohort of individuals followed over time, and the outcome here, of course, was incident acquisition of HIV. What did the researchers find? This is the list of risk factors that they found were significantly associated with the risk of acquiring HIV. And I want to focus on the second factor of incarceration and make three things clear. First, obviously, incarceration, people who were incarcerated or who were recently incarcerated in Vancouver had 2.74 times higher risk of HIV acquisition than people who were not incarcerated. And you might say, well, that makes sense. Of course, we know that incarceration selects for people who are higher risk, who use drugs more often, who are involved in sex work and other activities that place them at risk of HIV. But I would point out that through the magic of statistics, that estimate accounts for facts like that. Further, in a secondary analysis, it was determined that approximately 1 in 5 of all of the HIV infections in Vancouver up to that point were the result of incarceration. So, in an environment with, at the time, a quite mature and rigorous harm reduction environment, the fact remained that because of incarceration, 20% of individuals in that community became infected with HIV. And I will suggest to you today that that is the rule and not the exception. And that indeed, the view from science is that I think these three things we can say to be somewhat true. The first is science has developed a range of effective interventions to prevent and treat HIV among people who use drugs. This is not a question of us needing more technology in order to prevent or treat HIV. Science, clinical medicine, the community at large has the tools it requires to prevent and treat this deadly infection. The second thing we can say with certainty is that people who use drugs have yet to benefit equitably from advances made to control the HIV pandemic. Recently, of course, we saw the very happy news that people who are living with HIV in some key affected populations now have a life expectancy in excess of their HIV-negative peers. This is a tremendous accomplishment, and it speaks to the real advances over the last number of years. However, those same studies indicated that over the same time period, the estimated life expectancy for HIV-positive people who use drugs has declined. This is something that should shame and shock us all. And what I will suggest is that although there are many factors which might explain parts of this, the thing to my mind that overlies all of this deficit, this inequitable response, is the fact of criminalization. That is the fact that in all of our societies, the dominant response to people who use drugs is not compassion or care, but rather it is arrest, incarceration, and worse. And what I would like to do then is to offer from Vancouver some of the science that we have tried to develop to illustrate these factors. And what I'm going to do is use science or evidence from the different stages of the HIV prevention and care cascade. When it comes to HIV prevention, of course, we know that there's copious evidence suggesting that the activities of law enforcement and the activities of correctional systems interfere with access to the essential interventions to prevent and treat HIV, be it methadone, be it needle exchange, be it antiretroviral therapy. And quite recently, there was a high-profile review published in Lancet HIV, which systematically reviewed all of the science on HIV criminalization and its effect on criminalization of people who use drugs and its effect on HIV. And of all the studies they reviewed, they found that over 80% of those studies concluded that criminalization of people who use drugs, both policing and incarceration, had a negative effect on HIV risk. In other words, the actions of law enforcement and the correctional systems increased the risk of HIV acquisition and disease progression. What about testing and linkage to care, the first step of the 90-90-90 cascade? We know from evidence around the world that drug users often avoid testing because it will bring them into contact with surveillance and criminal justice authorities. Recently, of course, there's been some suggestion that correctional facilities might be an excellent venue for seek, test, and treat initiatives. However, unfortunately, to date, the evidence suggests that the actual yield of new cases is lower than hoped. There are ongoing concerns about respect for human rights, confidentiality, and privacy in closed settings. And this is throughout the world, not just in North America. And unfortunately, the evidence also indicates that there are very low levels of linkage to care for people who are diagnosed with enclosed settings. We all know, of course, as well, that for people who are living with HIV, who are in correctional facilities, there are problems with access and adherence to HIV medications. Clinical trials have shown that people who are in correctional facilities can and do sometimes succeed and achieve high levels of adherence to treatment. However, time and again, community-based studies have shown that incarceration is a risk factor for poorer treatment patterns. We found this recently in a study of initiation of antiretroviral therapy using data from our setting, which I should point out has a very large and robust seek, test, and treat campaign among people who use drugs. The study was very small. It only involved 133 people. However, we chose these people because they seroconverted after they had been recruited into our study. So we were able to follow them along. And we found in a statistical model that was adjusted for drug use, it was adjusted for CD4 and other measures, that people who were incarcerated had approximately a 48% lower chance of initiating treatment compared to those who were not incarcerated. This continued on with adherence to therapy. In this study we published a number of years ago. And what we looked at was the continued incarceration of many people who use drugs, which is a consistent characteristic of their contact with the criminal justice system. And what we found, again in a statistical model that we adjusted for drug use and other risk factors for non-adherence, was that the more times people went in and out of prison, the greater was their risk of being non-adherent to therapy. In our study, people who were incarcerated more than 5 times during the study were over 3 times more likely not to be adherent to their medications. Unfortunately, this has followed on with their effects on their viral load. And of course, viral load and suppression of viral load is the final cascade step, and in many ways the most important step to stall disease transmission and to ensure that individuals cannot pass along the infection. And in this study, which we have just submitted for review, what we did is we classified individuals into 3 states. Either they were in the community, or they were in the community and under some form of criminal justice attention, such as parole or bail, or they were in correctional facilities. And we found a dose-dependent relationship. The people who were in bail but in the community were approximately 22% less likely to be suppressed. People who were, and then people who were in prisons were approximately 39% less likely to be virally suppressed, which of course has very important implications not only for their disease, but also of course for passing along the infection. So what should I say in conclusion? I think unfortunately that the evidence to date indicates that contact with the criminal justice system for people who use drugs is ubiquitous and harmful. I focused on HIV, but other things such as overdose, engagement in therapy for drug dependence all indicate that contact with the criminal justice system is negatively associated with these things. When it comes to HIV care and prevention, there is a great wealth of evidence from around the world, including Vancouver and other settings, showing that contact with the criminal justice system interrupts and interferes with exposure and access and adherence to all of the essential elements of the essential package for HIV prevention and care. This is not only of concern for us in the HIV movement, but also should be of concern to individuals because this clearly violates the international rules around prisoner health and the Nelson Mandela rules. What does this mean for us in science? I think it's clear that there are, and have been for many years since the beginning of the pandemic, efforts to mitigate the impacts of the criminal justice system on the health of people who use drugs. And certainly I share the stage with many people who have developed evidence-based interventions to mitigate the negative impacts. Unfortunately, though, to end on a sour note, I think it's probably clear from the weight of evidence that for as long as the criminal justice response remains our dominant response to people who use drugs, we will continue to see a deficit in the HIV response. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, MJ. It's now my great honour to introduce our next speaker, Anja Sarang from the Netherlands. Anja is a public health and human rights activist from Russia, and for the past 20 years, Anja's work has focused on developing and supporting the emerging harm reduction movement in Russia and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Through training and networking activities, Anja has received a Master's in Drugs and Public Policy from the University of London and in Medical Anthropology and Sociology from the University of Amsterdam, where her research focused on gender and sexuality and access to HIV prevention for men who have sex with men and transgender people in Tajikistan. Her research interest focuses on the qualitative studies in human rights, access, prevention and treatment of HIV, hepatitis C, tuberculosis and overdose for drug users and other key affected populations in the EECA region, as well as gender issues. Over to you, Anja.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak at the session. It's quite amazing how our session builds up, because actually my presentation will be a perfect continuation for MJ's talk, and I will try to give an example of quite an extreme, on one hand, extreme approach to criminalization of people who use drugs, but on the other hand, an example of this approach is also typical and illustrates the structural problems that we face when we are trying to address HIV and other health issues in this group. So I'm going to speak about Russia, the country that I come from and where my organization provides services for people who use drugs. Russia is a big country, and there are estimated 5 to 6 million people who use drugs, of whom maybe 2 million are injectors. The drug strategy in Russia that was accepted 8 years ago is still based on the zero tolerance approach, and no, it does not mention human rights or public health issues. Harm reduction programs are mentioned as a threat to the national strategy. The strategy also advocates social pressure on people who use drugs in order to motivate them to achieve this abstinence from drugs. So the state-sponsored stigma is enforced on these people. As a consequence of this disastrous policy, we have a huge HIV and TB crisis in Russia. We are now the third country in the world with fastest growing HIV epidemic after South Africa and Nigeria. 2/3 of European HIV cases are now focused in Russia, and we are the only country in Europe that has still increasing rates of new HIV infections. Just last year, 10 people get infected in Russia every hour, and over 100,000 new cases were registered. Almost 32,000 people have died of AIDS. TB is the main cause of death of people who live with HIV, majority of whom, about 60%, are people who inject drugs. So last year, over 35,000 patients with co-infection were registered. We don't have evidence-based drug treatment available in Russia. The opioid substitution treatment is still illegal, and as I said, needle and syringe programs are considered a threat to the national drug strategy. So the services that we provide in Moscow are actually going against the pressure from the government. The only response, the only solution that the government can provide for people who use drugs is incarceration. So out of 650,000 prisoners, 25, 1/4 of all the prisoners are there for drug crimes, mostly drug possession for personal use. 40% of all women in prisons are also convicted for drug crimes. Drug users are the main target for enforcement. In 2015, the number of people in prison for drug possession was 7,600 higher than the number of people in prison for drug trafficking. Prison is also the source of TB. And for people with a very weakened immune system, weakened by HIV and by drug dependency without access to treatment, this often equals death sentence. And I would like to share with you a personal story, a story of my friend. His name was Kostya Proletarsky. He was a good friend and HIV activist. In order to share his story, the Rights Reporter Foundation from Hungary have made an animation movie. We made it together. I interviewed Kostya in 2009, and he shared the story of his well, actually, you will see it in the animation, so I will not tell it again. But I think this story is very, very sad, but it's also very, very typical, and it illustrates very well all the problems that we face dealing in the environment of repressive drug policy. So, Kostya Proletarsky.
Октября 2008 года мой друг Костик Пролетарский из-за состояния здоровья был освобожден из лечебно-исправительного учреждения номер 4 в Карелии. Это в России, недалеко от Полярного круга. После освобождения Костя все время находился в Боткинской больнице в Санкт-Петербурге, пытаясь восстановить здоровье, подорванное за несколько лет, проведенных на зоне. Меня настолько потрясли и ужаснули его рассказы про жизнь в колонии, что я решила записать и его рассказ, и рассказ его мамы Ирины о жизни обычных заключенных с ВИЧ и туберкулезом. Давай, ладно, рассказывай тогда.
Ну, в 2006 году меня осудили на 3 года общего режима. На тюрьме мне нашли туберкулез, и после чего меня отправили. Ну, этапировали в Карелию, в Онда, туберкулезная зона. Лагерь.
И у тебя был ВИЧ?
Да, у меня был ВИЧ. Я до того, как меня посадили, я принимал АРВ, начал принимать АРВ. Ну и вот когда я приехал в тюрьму, соответственно, ну я всем сказал об этом, да, всем врачам, которые меня принимали, там, что у меня вот такая ситуация, и мне нужны в жизни необходимые лекарства вот эти. Ну, как бы мне нельзя прекращать это все, прерывать. Мне сказали, успокойся, и все.
И что?
Ну, ничего, не дали мне, ничего. Вообще ничего. Там было много смертей, на самом деле. Я очень много видел, умирали люди.
И вот, наверное, не знаю, лет в 17, наверное, я так понимаю, Он уже вот дошел до героина. 12, наверное, вот так вот с этой бедой мы жили. И вот почти каждый год что-нибудь доделали. То он сам переломается, в реабилитационные центры ездил, он объездил всю страну. Не справлялся. Он и сам переламывался. Ну, как мать, наверное, к сыну я всегда относилась к этому. Конечно, ругалась и дрались, и все было, все было. Момент такой настал, что я уже с ним жить не могла.
А что ты там рассказывал, каким-то азотом или какой-то хуйней?
Хлоркой это?
Хлоркой какой-то?
Не, ну это у всех, это не только ВИЧевых там касается, да? То есть это по приезду в лагере там с тебя сбивают спесь, так сказать. Ну, показывает кто хозяин, это хлорка с аммиаком заливается. Допустим, 30 литров там и раствора этой хлорки горячей водой и аммиаком заливается тебе в камеру. Ну, я опустил глаза на пол и смотрю, что дым идет просто от досок, представляешь? Такой раствор делают, что ты практически на грани там, потери сознания, понимаешь? Когда тебе выжигает глаза, там, ты не можешь дышать, у тебя уже пена идет из желудка, да? Это просто как газовая камера, эти серьезно говорю, заливают, и там дышать просто нечего. И у тебя даже лицо вот начинает все растворять, вообще разъедает, представляешь? На газовой камере мне одевали на голову противогаз. Ну, вот я нюхал аммиак, дышал достаточно продолжительное время. И я приехал в лагерь, у меня был инфильтративный туберкулез легких, не очень серьезно, да, даже дырок, то есть очагов нет, да, просто там затемнение. И после там месяца пребывания там, и нескольких там экзекуций этой хлорки мне делают рентген, и мне говорят, что у меня распад обоих легких начался. И вот я освободился, домой приехал, у меня 40 температура. Я приехал в больницу в Будке. Туберкулез, у меня было обострение туберкулеза. Высокая температура у меня держалась, наверное, где-то месяца полтора. Сбивали. И РВ хотят назначить, но до сих пор не назначают. Ну, потому что... Не, активен туберкулез. Да. Не рискуют. Потому что тут риск такой 50 на 50. Либо туберкулез обострится так, что будет летальный исход, либо все будет нормально.
Thank you so much. This applause go to Istvan, who've been really working on this movie since 2009. We are really glad that we are moving along with it. The guys are still crowdfunding for the release of the full version. So I will leave the cards and you can get some information, also a link to the pilot of the movie. I must say that Kostya died shortly after I took this interview. It was back in 2009, and that's also the year when my organization started to work. The organization decided to focus on providing life-saving services for people who use drugs, despite the government opposition. And also just a bit of good news that just in the beginning of this year, Kostia's family has finally received the compensation from the European Court on Human Rights for this inhumane treatment and tortures that he suffered in the colony, and also for the damage to his health and obviously life. Of course, it's not consolation for Kostia's mother and his wife and his child, who is now 10 years old, but at least it's some restoration of justice, and it's some hope for other people that it will be possible to achieve some justice. So I'm going to leave the floor now. I'm sorry for a very sad story, but I think it was good that we had this animation and we could share it with you, and you could see the real person and the real person's story. Things didn't change in this last year, just in this last 10 years. Just yesterday we were asked the question if things with access to treatment or in prisons with tortures have changed, and unfortunately they have not. So during this all these years, despite all the advocacy and strategic litigation work, the situation is not changing. And I think it's important to understand that before we can aim towards zero new infection, we should really focus on zero criminalization. It will not be possible to achieve reduction in HIV infection among people who inject drugs if we are not able to provide life-saving services, if we are not able to protect people from imprisonment, if we are not able to protect their human rights and dignity. Thank you very much.
Anya, thank you so much for that compelling presentation and that really powerful tribute to Kostya. I can say, having interviewed people in Gachina in Russia outside of St. Petersburg, that story is told time and time again. So thank you very much for bringing that personal story to us. Our next speaker is Natasha Martin. Natasha is an associate professor at the University of California in San Diego. She's an infectious disease economic modeler. She models both infections and interventions to reduce the risk or the consequences of HIV and other infectious diseases in key populations like people who inject drugs, MSM, and female sex workers. Natasha.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the organizers for having me speak here, and also just to echo the thanks to Anya for that very impactful story, which I hope helps underscore the numbers which I'll be presenting in my presentation today. So I'm here to talk about hepatitis and TB co-infection among people who inject drugs and why we're failing them in this regard. Here are my disclosures. So starting with hepatitis C, the burden of hepatitis C among people who inject drugs is extremely high, with a recent systematic review estimating that over half of people who inject drugs worldwide have evidence of a history of hepatitis C infection that corresponds to just over 8 million people. Additionally, many of those are co-infected with HIV and hepatitis C. Another recent review estimating that 1.3 million people who inject drugs are co-infected with HIV and hepatitis C globally. That's over half of the global burden of co-infection. Fortunately, we have effective prevention interventions, and we've known for a long time that harm reduction interventions such as opiate substitution therapy and needle and syringe programs are effective at preventing HIV. Recent work, a recent systematic review for the Cochrane database has provided important new evidence that these interventions are also effective at preventing hepatitis C. With this study finding that opiate substitution therapy reduces an individual's risk of acquiring hepatitis C by half. And in combination with high coverage needle and syringe programs, together these could reduce an individual's risk of acquiring hepatitis C by over 70%. So underscoring the importance of harm reduction in preventing both HIV and hepatitis C transmission. Unfortunately, the global coverage of these interventions is extremely low, with a recent systematic review in Lancet Global Health estimating that globally there are only 16 OST recipients per 100 persons who inject drugs. That's well below the WHO recommendation of 40% OST coverage. Similarly, the coverage of needle and syringe programs is extremely poor, with a global estimate of only 33 needle and syringes distributed via needle and syringe programs per PWID per year, again, far below the WHO recommendations of over 200 needle and syringes per people who inject drugs per year. So the same review, unfortunately, concluded that less than 1% of people who inject drugs live in countries with high coverage of both opiate substitution therapy and needle and syringe programs, really underscoring the lack of coverage of these interventions, and this insufficient coverage will continue to fuel HIV and hepatitis C epidemics. Fortunately, we have highly effective treatments for hepatitis C, which are now short course, 8 to 12 weeks, all oral, highly tolerable pill-a-day therapies that can cure hepatitis C in over 90% of cases. These amazing new treatments are equally effective among HIV co-infected individuals as well as hepatitis C mono-infected individuals, and evidence shown here on this slide indicates that they're equally as effective for individuals who are on opiate substitution therapy or those with current injecting drug use. Despite this promise of hepatitis C treatment, unfortunately, treatment rates among people who inject drugs are very low. In part, this is because of continued restrictions limiting scale-up of treatments to people who inject drugs. This is contrary to stated guidelines. Evidence on this slide indicates that among many states in the United States, as well as some European countries, there are restrictions in terms of drug and alcohol use. This is compounded by prioritization of these very expensive hepatitis C treatments to individuals with more advanced liver disease. Because people who inject drugs tend to be younger with less advanced disease, the combination of these restrictions for drug and alcohol use as well as prioritization of therapy means that very few people who inject drugs are being treated for their hepatitis C. Some recent modeling work that we've done, led by Javier Cepeda, looked at the implications of these restrictions of harm reduction and the Russian policy prohibiting opiate agonist therapy and the limited provision of needle and syringe programs and antiretroviral therapy on HIV and overdose among people who inject drugs in Russia. He looked at two settings in the rural, Ural and Siberian regions of Russia and found that scale-up of needle and syringe programs, as well as legal changes allowing for the scale-up of opiate agonist therapy to half of people who inject drugs, combined with the scale-up of ART to 65% coverage among HIV-infected people who inject drugs, could avert 53% and 63% of HIV infections among people who inject drugs in Omsk and Ekaterinburg, respectively, within the next 10 years. And additionally, these interventions could have a beneficial impact on preventing drug overdose and preventing approximately 30% of fatal overdoses by 2028. So I think this is really important evidence underscoring the need for policy change and scale up of these harm reduction interventions and the multiple benefits they can have. Additionally, a recent study by Yazdin Yazdapana's group showed the impact of these scale-up of harm reduction could have on both HIV as well as hepatitis C incidence among people who inject drugs in a range of settings in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Their study found that scaled-up harm reduction could prevent over 35% of both hepatitis C and HIV infections over 20 years among people who inject drugs in a range of settings. They looked at Belarus, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Moldova, and Tajikistan. Additionally, they found that you could have these interventions were particularly effective and if provided with HIV and hepatitis C treatment. So again, underscoring the multiple benefits of harm reduction in terms of preventing both HIV, hepatitis C, and overdose. Moving on to HIV and tuberculosis co-infection. We know that among HIV-infected individuals, people who inject drugs are at higher risk of tuberculosis compared to other risk groups. And as well, among HIV and TB co-infected individuals in Eastern Europe, one study found that multi-drug resistant TB is significantly associated with injecting drug use. So there's a high risk of both TB and MDR TB. As well, unfortunately, health outcomes are substantially worse among people who inject drugs who are co-infected with these individuals. A study in Spain found that HIV, TB co-infected people who inject drugs had much lower survival compared to other co-infected risk groups. In part, this is due to continued marginalization, delayed diagnosis of TB and HIV, and poor adherence to TB and HIV treatment. Additionally, this is a particular concern here in the European region, with the WHO Europe showing that although overall there have been declines in TB incidence as well as TB mortality among HIV-infected individuals, which you see here in the red, it's the only global region where both TB incidence as well as TB mortality is increasing in that group. Additionally, and very concerning, the burden of MDR-TB in the WHO European region is particularly high, with 19% of new cases and 55% of previously treated cases of TB showing evidence of multi-drug resistance. This really underscores the need for both integrated HIV and TB services, both in the WHO Europe region as well as worldwide. Now, in part, understanding these data on HCV and TB burden and health outcomes among people who inject drugs really requires understanding the overlapping syndemics of drug use, incarceration, and infectious disease transmission, as you've heard from every speaker on this panel today. So a recent review estimated that globally 58% of people who inject drugs had a history of incarceration. That is staggering. The mass incarceration of people who inject drugs as a result of criminalization of drug use continues to create a conducive environment for the transmission of HIV, viral hepatitis, as well as tuberculosis, both within these prisons and then within the community. Prisons serve to concentrate people who inject drugs who are at high risk of these diseases, as well as amplify the adverse health outcomes and transmission of these diseases through overcrowding, poor infrastructure and ventilation, a lack of health care and prevention interventions in this setting. Additionally, malnutrition, stress, and HIV infection further deteriorates health among people who inject drugs and, for example, makes individuals who are infected with TB more likely to have TB disease. This results in both deterioration of the health of individuals, transmission of these diseases within prison, and then on release, further transmission of these diseases within the community. As a result, reviews have found an extremely high burden of HIV, viral hepatitis, and tuberculosis among prisoners, much higher than in the general population and particularly high among incarcerated people who inject drugs. A recent systematic review and meta-analysis by our group, led by Jack Stone, found additionally that globally, a recent incarceration is associated with an increased risk of both acquiring HIV as well as hepatitis C, and that this risk may persist post-release, further providing evidence of incarceration fueling these disease epidemics. Unfortunately, there's limited harm reduction in prison globally. This slide just showing the lack of comprehensive harm reduction in prison, with very few countries offering both needle and syringe programs as well as opiate substitution therapy in prison. So modeling work that our group has done in a variety of papers published in The Lancet looked at Ukraine as a case study in terms of examining the contribution of incarceration as well as the potential impact of prison interventions on HIV, hepatitis C, and TB epidemics among people who inject drugs. Our studies showed that incarceration could contribute 28 to 55% of new HIV infections among people who inject drugs over 15 years in Ukraine. Prison opiate agonist therapy with to 50% coverage with retention on release could avert 20% of new HIV infections over that same time period, and a similar intervention could also reduce hepatitis C incidence among people who inject drugs by over 25%. Additionally, some statistical analyses that we've done looking at incarceration and tuberculosis found that in the Ukraine, incarceration could result in 75% and 86% of all incident TB cases among HIV-infected and HIV-negative people who inject drugs, respectively. So really contributing a substantial amount to these ongoing epidemics. So in summary, why are we failing people who inject drugs? Well, as I mentioned, less than 1% of people who inject drugs live in countries with both high coverage of OST and NSP. As mentioned several times today, the continuing criminalization of drug use and mass incarceration continues to fuel these epidemics, and the low coverage of treatments for these diseases continues to hamper progress towards elimination. What is needed? We clearly need a substantial global scale-up of harm reduction, and that's harm reduction that is high quality, evidence-based, and affordable. We need integrated services for people who inject drugs, providing harm reduction combined with HIV, hepatitis C, and TB testing and treatment without restriction or stigma. And as mentioned today, we need reform of criminal justice systems, decriminalization of drug use, diversion programs, and access to health services for incarcerated people who inject drugs in prison, as well as continuity of care on release. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. We're going to move into a Q&A shortly, but I just really want to say that what we've heard today, if we didn't already know this, the world has failed miserably in responding to the HIV epidemic amongst people who use drugs. New infections have increased by 33% between 2011 and 2015. Not only is there a lack of care and support and civil society looking out for the interests of people who use drugs, but the incredible abuse and cruel and unusual punishment that's dished out to people who use drugs that Anya and others have talked to us about today. Then we're going to now ask, there may be somebody in the room from the Netherlands who might like to stand up to one of the microphones here and give us a bit of a 2-minute overview of the record of the Netherlands in responding and eliminating new HIV infections amongst people who inject drugs. So is there anybody here that might be able to speak to that?
We're going to open up the floor for some questions, and I'm going to take one of the co-chair's prerogatives to ask the first question while folks come up to the microphone. But without any sort of coordination of your presentations, it was very clear that the underlying theme was a structural intervention of decriminalization. And we were walked all along the criminalization process, from policing to the incarceration itself, both short-term and long-term incarceration, and the increased consequences of incarceration itself on these syndemics of HIV, TB, and hepatitis C, and other negative consequences, and the post-release environment. And it seems to me, and I'm going to ask this to the speakers, it seems to me we've known this for a while. This isn't new. But yet the title of this session is What Gets in the Way? And so given all of that, and the fact that we know the right thing to do, what has gotten in the way of that, and what are the solutions? And folks, when you're ready to come up to the microphone and ask questions, please do. And when you do, identify yourself and where you're from. So, speakers?
Is that on?
Go ahead.
Yeah. How to say it without sounding cliched? Sam Friedman wrote a brilliant paper once. It was the Rolliston oration at the Harm Reduction Conference in Paris. And what he basically pointed out was that we in the harm reduction movement consider that those who don't get it, those prohibitionists who support ideologically based approaches rather than evidence-based approaches, just don't get it. They're ignorant, they're dumb, they're stupid or whatever. And Sam's analysis said, no, that's wrong. What you've got to look at is who benefits. To whose benefit is the criminalisation of drug users. I mean, I work a lot with police because I see there's a lot of potential for change and a lot of potential for good outcomes getting police involved. But I recognise fully that in most places at most times the police are agents of the state whose job is to maintain social structures, and reproduce social structures. And inside those social structures, we differentiate often by the drugs that people use. I ran a workshop in China in the early 1990s for senior public health and senior public security from all around the country. And it was a huge learning experience for me. We made every mistake we could possibly make. I was doing it with WHO. And the people from public security who came along, it was the day after National Drug Control Day, and the China Daily proudly announced that they had publicly executed their 1000th drug trafficker. Drug trafficker meaning small-time, dealing to keep themselves in it. And I was speaking to these people, and I was saying the normal sorts of things that I say, like you can't rehabilitate a dead drug user, and public security went, yes, that is our philosophy too. At the same time, every night we have a banquet and we get blind drunk on 55 proof Motai. So we're executing people whose drug is a pharmacologically almost harmless substance, and we're celebrating by drinking one of the worst drugs I've ever drunk. And I came away with the conclusion that there's no need for deep analysis. This is my drug and I'm in power, that's your drug and I'm in power because of you. So I think that the answer is, as I say, without trying not to sound cliched, the answer is simply that we live in societies that depend on marginalisation. What's going on at the moment in the world, I just think, is one of the most shocking things that that we are increasingly building societies on division and marginalisation, and that's the simple answer to it. There may be other answers.
There are other answers, and I think Natasha's going to give us yet another.
Yeah, I think so. I work in San Diego, which is right on the U.S.-Mexico border, and I think what's going on there is quite an interesting example of what I think is really one of the things that I think is desperately needed is evidence showing the positive benefits of public health-oriented drug law reform and decriminalization. So we have theoretical modeling evidence indicating it might be good. We have all these statistical associations showing policing and incarceration and the negative impact that can have. But I don't think we have enough rigorous examples that show all of the potential benefits of decriminalization and public health-oriented drug law reform. So in Mexico in 2010, they actually implemented drug law reform where they decriminalized small amounts of possession of drugs as well as implementing diversion to drug treatment after an individual was detained several times, 3 times. And what happened was a really interesting story in Tijuana in that, this occurred in the state of Baja California in Tijuana in 2013. The law changed. And Stephanie Strathty and other members of her groups followed up among people who inject drugs in Tijuana, their exposures to policing, and saw no change at all in police harassment and policing exposures and incarceration after that law change. And when they went and interviewed the police officers in Tijuana, it turned out that they didn't know about the law. No one had told them about it. They weren't given any procedures in terms of how to implement it properly. If any had heard about it, they'd heard it from just the television and just media campaigns. And some subsequent epidemic modeling work that we did, led by Anique Borquez, showed that the failure to implement that drug reform, cost us in terms of failing to avert HIV infections, but that it could, prevent a substantial number of HIV infections if implemented properly. Now, after Stephanie Strathty found out that information, Leo Beletsky and Stephanie Strathty actually implemented a really interesting police education program where they train the police in terms of both the legal reform as well as the risks of bloodborne virus transmission in an attempt to both educate them about the reform as well as improve policing interactions between the police and people who inject drugs. And that intervention has shown really promising success in terms of changing the attitudes of the police officers, educating them about the reform, and really increasing the probability that these public health-oriented drug reforms could have a positive public health impact. So I think we need more evidence like that and an awareness that perhaps just changing the legal policy won't be enough, that will be sufficient, but there'll be needing to be an increasing number of educational programs and police interventions to really realize the promise.
Yeah, so I would also say that there are some other examples like Portugal, and I think we all know the right thing to do, but the political will, I think, is one of the big challenges. Kostya, would you like to sort of identify yourself and identify the person whom you'd like to speak? First speaker. I think the magicians are in the back. Can we get the mic turned on at the first speaker, please? Yeah, that seems to work. Thank you.
Okay, so I think this session summarized very nicely why we are failing. I mean, Natasha's last slide showed, I guess, three main reasons for that. But I would like to expand more on the solutions, just as you proposed, and turn your attention to some success stories and try to, derive some lessons from it. The case of Ukraine, like, you had several slides on Ukraine. And as you know, during the past years, we didn't have much progress in policy. I mean, we still have criminalization, lots of drug-related sentences. We don't have much in prisons, no harm reduction, no OST. We did not expand substitution therapy much. It's just, around 3% prevalence. And, there are lots of other things that we didn't succeed with. But we did see massive reduction in incidence. Several studies do confirm that the incidence has decreased substantially. Now we have just above 1% incidence per 100 person years, which is a progress compared to what we had. And what we did do, and what, in my opinion, did work, was really a massive increase in coverage of harm reduction. And now we are covering more than 200,000 people with harm reduction services each year, which is above 60%. Except for that reason, as I just mentioned, we don't have any substantial progress. So I think that massive harm reduction did work in case of Ukraine.
Another question?
Hello, my name is Rita. I'm a journalist from Russia. My English is very bad, поэтому я попрошу. Какие конкретные меры в органах правопорядка, может быть, реформы, могут заставить полицейских быть более нежными с потребителями наркотиков? Потому что я не могу представить, что в России те люди, которые сейчас работают в полиции, могут начать относиться к потребителям наркотиков вообще как-то иначе.
What kind of reforms or actions can make police officers to be more gentle towards people who use drugs? Because I can't really imagine any police officer in Russia being very kind to a drug user.
That is an excellent question. This is something that I have spent a long time and worked on for a long time, trying to come up with a simple answer to that question, and there is not one. A police officer I worked with once said that of police, in relation to harm reduction, in relation to, I like that phrase, being gentle, that a third of them get it, a third of them could get it, and a third of them will never get it. Policing is the most extraordinary profession because it contains some of the most sympathetic, humane, committed, caring individuals that I've ever met in the same organisation, often in the same office as the biggest fascist thugs that I've ever met. The proportions are different in police agencies in different countries. In some countries, most of them get it. Netherlands is a classic example. I've been asked by visiting delegations to find a Dutch police officer to tell them about harm reduction. Who runs harm reduction in the Dutch police? There is no such person because it's throughout the culture of the police. Other countries, Russia being a prime example, you would have to search very long and hard to find a sympathetic police officer. But I think the task is to find that third who get it, who work with them to embrace the third who could get it, to the point where they outnumber those who will never get it. It's a long, slow process. It's part of the whole process of police reform. It won't happen quickly. But, as I say, in every police agency I've ever worked with, there are sympathetic, supportive individuals. They're not being supported in their own agency. And I want to make the point, they're not here at this conference. There's half a dozen police at this conference who are supportive, and that's it. There's hardly a session or a presentation about what we could be doing, what we are doing, to bring the police better on side. We as a sector could be doing a heck of a lot more to be engaging the police and tackling the problems that we face. I have other answers. I would really like to follow up the conversation, but individually with you if you want.
Thank you very much. Michel?
Yes, good afternoon. Michel Kazachkin, and expressing myself as a member of the Global Commission on Drug Policy here. What's obvious from all of your presentations is that decriminalization comes as a major harm reduction measure to take. And I think I would suggest that we all adopt that language. Criminalization is not the solution that was in your question, Fred, but it's a necessary, essential, necessary harm reduction measure to add to our set of tools. And I wouldn't wish that we continue to think of harm reduction as only a set of biomedical interventions. The solution will come from the next steps because the damage and the harm from illegal trade will not go out with decriminalization, but only with ending prohibition and moving to legal regulation of drugs. So that's a longer-term vision, although the debate is now open. But that was my comment somehow. And if I can ask a question, I'd like to ask it from Natasha. And thank you for your excellent presentation. I must say I didn't know that the Cochrane analysis which you showed. I wanted to ask you, is there any, what's the effect of needle exchange programs without OST? Because this conference focuses a lot on Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and for reasons you mentioned, OST is either absent or very, very low scale in the region. So just if we were to scale up dramatically needle exchange, do we know what impact that would have?
Yes, so the review does address that, and I did not show it because the evidence is slightly more mixed in that case, particularly because of evidence that does not show an impact of NSP in North America. If you restrict the analysis to Europe or excluding North American studies, then that evidence was stronger that NSP can prevent hepatitis C acquisition. But again, it did seem to vary by study site. There was substantial heterogeneity by country, likely due to differences in terms of service provision as well as coverage in those settings, I think.
So what's the secret? Why is OST so effective?
So are you asking me in comparison to needle and syringe programs, or?
Yes.
I think that, to be honest, I think we need more evidence to show the impact of needle and syringe programs when provided in a comprehensive kind of service, a low threshold program with wide access. And in particular, I think that there needs to be more evidence in terms of the impact of that in combination, although the evidence that I showed you does seem to point towards this importance of NSP. I mean, the tricky thing about needle and syringe programs is how you measure that coverage. And again, the review found more impact in terms of needle and syringe programs that offered high coverage of their high coverage, so where an individual received more syringes than they used to inject. And there's better evidence that those are better than, that those have more of an impact as opposed to just a program that may provide very minimal coverage.
Yeah. I will say that from those systematic reviews and meta-analyses, there are always a fair amount of heterogeneity, and first of all, there's almost no low or middle income countries sort of as part of that, so we don't know as much information about that. It's almost always restricted to high income countries. And then, of course, the effect is going to depend upon, for instance, when you're modeling the substitution therapy with the syringe exchange program in terms of what are the drugs that are being used. For instance, what's happening in emerging places where amphetamine-type substances are sort of increasing and stuff like that. So, one might imagine that where that is increasing, the substitution therapy will have less of an effect as that secondary thing. But most of the data, at least in terms of the modeling and even self-evident data, is that it requires a combination that they're synergistic together.
I agree. Rick, one thing I would mention is that I think it was striking how little heterogeneity there was in the impact of opiate substitution therapy across the global regions. That although I agree with you completely in terms of the differences in epidemics and drug injecting, it was quite, there was not that much heterogeneity in that outcome.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, my question would be a continuation of questions by Rita, because I want to ask about engaging the law enforcement in harm reduction services, because I'm from Russia too, and the evaluation system of police officers is really stupid in our country, because the level of crime should be compared with the level of crime of the last year. That means if the police officers don't find any crime, it means that they don't work at all. So they have to create some kind of crime, they plant evidence, and the main source of it is drug users, because it's really easy to plant evidence on drug users. It's really easy to use them as the evidence that they work. So how do we really engage police officers in a highly corrupt environment like that?
I guess that's me, huh? I haven't worked in Russia. I've worked in a lot of other countries. I've not worked in Russia. And I talked to Anya, and we had a Russian Major General of Police from Moscow came to the 2004 Harm Reduction Conference. Most extraordinary thing that I've ever seen. And his colleague, his senior, came along with him and sat in the audience, and at one point he just gave up. He was trying to say something harm reductionist, and it was just too scary because his boss was sitting watching him, and his boss came up on the stage, I hope you remember, Anya, and started shouting that methadone is death sentence. Russia's drug problems come from Tajikistan. We bombed Tajikistan off map. No more drug problems. And I am not caricaturing. That's how it was. I've not worked in Russia. All I've heard is stories about it. I can only talk about the police agencies in the countries I've worked in and worked with. I think that there's no panacea in this. We need decriminalisation, we need policy change at the top level, we need training of police in academies, continuing professional development. But as a tool of culture change, I do believe in peer education and peer advocacy. And I also know from very hard experience that the police don't listen to me. The police don't listen to any of us, to us health workers or policy. Police listen to other police. And finding police champions who know internally what the arguments are. I mean, it's a remarkably unstudied field. We don't know what police do with their time a lot of the time. We have very little research. Even in high-income countries, we have very little research about what police actually do with their time, and we have virtually no research about why they do what they do. My colleague Melissa Jardine did studies with ward-level police in Hanoi, looking at why they do not practice harm reduction. And she found that a lot of them had been educated in harm reduction, had been trained in harm reduction, understood it, agreed with it, but were subject to quotas, like you illustrated in Russia, that they had a quota of drug users that they had to arrest. So none of it's a panacea, but certainly finding police champions, and it's done on a limited scale, but where it's done, it's very effective, where you get a senior police officer who can speak the police language to a police audience. And often that means coming from I mean, one of the things that Law Enforcement HIV Network has done very nicely is to find those champions and help mobilise them to talk to other police agencies around human rights, around public health and around HIV and harm reduction. it's a small exercise and a small impact, but I just do not understand why we don't scale that up and do it on a much greater scale, because it promises. Sorry, I'm going on too long. The last point, though, is also it's an under-researched area. There's been far too few rigorous evaluations of the impact of getting police involved in HIV response, and we need a heck of a lot more good intervention evaluations like that.
Next person, identify yourself and direct your question.
Hi there, my name is Alicia. I work as a community health outreach promoter in the United States, and I am just going to continue asking you questions. Let's say that you have that police person who is championing like successful interventions. How do you rebuild trust with the community, especially in the United States, which is the ones I'm looking at? All they've done is beat these marginalized people to death. How do you rebuild that trust? That
goes to the heart of the whole thing. I look at places like Ferguson, Missouri, and I think, what's the first step back? And I talk to police officers in the States, and they say, fairly naively I must say, but they say we tried to rebuild trust in the community. We even had a program where our police officers in plain clothes went into the community to talk to community members. What did the community conclude? That they were seeking intelligence. They were undercover trying to find intelligence from the communities. What's the first step back? I don't know. Some of the divisions between community and police have got so bad and so terrible, so divisive, that I think abolish the whole thing and start again. However, having said that, the examples that I do know where there has been progress have been where police and community have come together to join together to tackle complex social issues. If you ask police agencies around the world what are the things that give them the most problems, what are the things they have most difficulty with, mental health is always up there. Mental health issues are always in the top 2 or 3. And look, the States is a special case. You know, gun violence, for instance. I mean, we think of the States as being the exemplar of gun violence. It's not. It's death by gunshot. America is only 12th on the scale of things in terms of per capita death by gunshot. But it is so racially and in other ways, what's the word I'm after, biased. And the divisions are so deep, and we have an administration that is deepening those divisions as hard as it can go. Finding problems that require I'm Australian. We have a terrible situation with the Indigenous communities, and it's been made worse by successive governments. There's some really good examples of programs that have been led by police, started by police, led by police in collaboration with the community to tackle issues like public drinking and alcohol-fueled violence. Brilliant. Illustrating that when police take the lead in those sorts of things, they can actually, and work with communities and join up with health and welfare, they can actually achieve enormous things. One of the problems is that none of those successful programs continues to exist because they don't fit government policy. But I think finding those sorts of issues like domestic violence, like mental health crises, and getting police to partner up. There's great examples of that in Canada, the core and hub model in Saskatchewan, in Glasgow, violence reduction unit in Glasgow that turned Glasgow from the gang violence capital of Europe into the cultural capital of Europe. I could go on. Better not.
Hi, I'm Nathan Sparling from HIV Scotland. I was glad that you talked about Glasgow, so it links into exactly what I was going to talk about. In Scotland, there's been...
Did you bring an interpreter, by the way?
No, sorry, I'll try and talk slightly slower. In Glasgow, there's been over the past 3 years, some really complacent actions for people who inject drugs. We've seen one of the biggest outbreaks of HIV infection amongst that community. Almost 1/5 of all of the community is infected with HIV, many of them that don't even know it yet. And one of the things that now, the action that's trying to happen is the opening of a drug consumption room in Glasgow. We've seen the closure of the largest needle exchange in Scotland was closed because of a rail company intervening in public health policy. The challenge that we've got in Scotland is the regulatory framework is controlled by Westminster in London.
Which is controlled by North Ireland.
and we can't find the arguments that there won't be essentially drug tourism to Glasgow if the regulatory framework was to change. And I wonder what sort of arguments we can take back to the UK to say, give us these changes so that we can do the best for the people that the community needs to serve.
The irony that, if you remember the history, the irony that the outbreak of HIV that was going on in Edinburgh and not in Glasgow in the early days, the supervised injecting facilities, I mean, they're coming. Canada is in the process of implementing, I don't know how many, I don't know that anyone, at least 30, but I think there's more than that. But there's pushback against that too, with the election of the Ford brother. But it's happening, and it'll happen in the UK. I absolutely guarantee it. It's happening in United States cities too, and one of the worries about it for me is that a number of the United States cities that are pushing ahead with developing safe injecting facilities or overdose prevention sites or drug consumption rooms, or whatever you call them, are offside with their police agencies, and they're doing it in the face of hostility from police, and that's a recipe for disaster. I'm sorry, Mahendra, I'm hogging the microphone. You go.
Thank you. The issues of drug consumption rooms are very close to my heart. I was one of the scientists that contributed to the evaluation of Insight in Vancouver. And this issue that you raise about fears around drug tourism, et cetera, was something that we never found any basis in empirical fact. It's a common criticism of drug consumption rooms, but as I said, it's nothing that's actually based in fact. I'd be happy to talk with you at length afterwards to talk about how the evaluation that we did in Vancouver might be helpful to you in your efforts to provide this life-saving service to people.
I'm sorry to take the microphone again. Just a quick comment to come back to our conversation. I think safe injection rooms is creating a physical space for decriminalization. That's to link it with our discussion. And somewhere it's a strong move towards decriminalization.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank all of the speakers for coming to us with sort of very diverse backgrounds and ideas and sort of a broad spectrum of inputs into why we've failed among people who inject drugs. I will also comment that HIV prevention and treatment among people who inject drugs is suffering the largest reduction globally, and so that will be an additional structural factor that I think will be playing a role, so our advocacy is going to be important. I'd like to thank my co-chair for sharing the podium here. I'd like to thank the audience, and I want to thank in advance all of you who are going to take these ideas and concepts and take them back home and make them work where they need to work. Thank you so much.